It's time for the 1430 Connection on 1430 WNAV and 99.9 FM, spotlighting news, newsmakers, and important community issues. Now, with this week's edition of the 1430 Connection, here is WNAV news anchor Donna Cole.
Welcome to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. My guest today is Frank Kuncir. He's a retired special agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He spent over 32 years conducting investigations in Virginia, Maryland, California, Alaska, and Florida, among other places. In 2003, Steve Williams, who was at that time the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, said, quote, "Agent Kuncir's career shows that one man can truly make a difference. His efforts to safeguard wildlife have benefited bald eagles, migratory birds, manatees, and other species, as well as the millions of Americans who treasure wildlife resources." In 2003, Special Agent Kuncir received the Guy Bradley Award for his contributions to protecting the nation's wildlife resources, unquote. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service press release, quote, Frank Kuncir's investigation into bald eagle deaths on Maryland's eastern shore documented misuse of the pesticide Carbofuran, prompting the withdrawal of registration for the pesticide's granular form in certain agricultural uses, in the process removing threats to eagles and other birds in several eastern states, unquote. All forms of Carbofuran have been banned in the U.S. since 2009. Frank, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you, Donna.
So you spent a lot of time investigating wildlife poisonings on the eastern shore.
I did that. It was a full-time profession for several years.
The work you did led to the EPA banning Carbofuran.
Myself and other team members, other special agents in other states, contributed to that effort, as well as service biologists and representatives from the Virginia Game Commission, the Maryland Maryland Wildlife Administration.
So you are familiar with what's been going on recently. I know you read some of my reporting. I know you've been following these cases. Since 2013, I have counted 35 dead bald eagles that died either by Carbofuran or suspected to be Carbofuran. There are probably more, yes?
That is correct. And I have done training for the service at the National Conservation Training Center, and one of my visual pointers is that what we find in wildlife deaths, especially by poisoning, that these deaths that we found only represent a tip of the iceberg. Special Agent Neil Hartman, who is in charge of the Region 6 Denver Mountain States region of the Division of Fish and Wildlife, in 1994 synopsized the deaths in that area, that they probably located at approximately 25% of the eagles that died in that area, meaning 75% were unaccounted for.
And why is that?
The nature of poisonings is usually shrouded in secrecy by purpose, if it's a purposeful poisoning, or because of the nature of the wild environment. Whereas at one time, I'll speak as to Delmarva, farms were family-based. Farm families were keenly attuned to the things that were happening in their backyards, so that they had if you will, a stewardship for the family farm, constantly being concerned about things that were happening in their surroundings. What has changed in agriculture, and not only Delmarva, but the entire continent, is we have large corporate farming entities now, so that hired laborers basically address part of the labor necessary to cultivate crops. So laborers will come in with large tractors and turn the soil. Other laborers will come in and do the planting. Others will do the necessary husbandry that's necessary for corn and soybean crops. So they're distantly removed. They don't have that same sense of stewardship that used to exist in farm communities.
But these poisonings by Carbofuran of wildlife are not new, even though we've become suddenly aware of them because of the 2016 incident in which 13 bald eagles were found on a farm in Federalsburg. You started investigating them when?
About 1985. Actually, my first investigation was actually in the Hagerstown region of the Western Shore. It was related to the utilization of poisoned corn to address a starling and blackbird problem which centered in downtown Hagerstown around the Mack truck factory, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of starlings and blackbirds died as a result, as well as Migratory Bird Treaty Act protected birds. And it was the discovery of a single snowy owl, which had actually predated upon a carcass of one of these starlings, that brought the case to our attention. Previous to that, it had been ongoing for several weeks. Hundreds of birds had died, but no one saw fit to pass these deaths on outside of local knowledge. They didn't get to the Maryland Natural Resource Police nor the Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Law Enforcement.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back on the 1430 Connection. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. My name is Donna Cole. I'm talking today with Frank Kuncir. He's a retired special agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He spent many years, over 3 decades, investigating wildlife crimes, including poisonings of birds on the Delmarva Peninsula. One of the cases that I mentioned previously that accounts for the 35 birds that I've counted is just above the Delmarva Peninsula in Pedricktown, New Jersey. The veterinarian that took care of those birds, that was one bird that died in that case, and that was April of 2018. 2 others were treated and released. She emailed me that she believed that birds were affected by Carbofuran. So some of these cases, I have Freedom of Information Acts in currently for. Others, I've already received toxicology reports, like the February 16 incident, and that was 13 bald eagles, and the January 2017 incident, 5 eagles in eastern Maryland that scavenged on a poison fox. So most of these cases, the birds are scavenging on wildlife that was targeted?
That's correct. The utilization of poisons usually is focused on a particular necessity on the part of the poisoner to address, if you will, a nuisance animal, so to speak. Animals that are preying on whatever vested interest the poisoner might have, i.e. in the West, it was sheep and cattle ranchers who legally using them to kill coyotes. We have pheasant and captive breeding mallard propagators who illegally use them to kill foxes, raccoons, skunks, coyotes, in order that to help them raise and release their pheasants and mallards. Trappers use them to kill fur-bearing animals and take the whole poisoned animal for sale in a fur shop. Landowners use them to kill what they consider to be nuisance animals, skunks and feral cats on their land.
Regarding the cases on the eastern shore on the Delmarva Peninsula that you investigated, your words were, in places where poisonings occur, the motivation is generally in protecting animals that are held on shooting preserves. That tends to be the motivation throughout the case history. True?
That has been a common motivation, yes. Usually in association with the poisonings, there are other illegal methodologies that are utilized, i.e. something called pole traps. Pole traps are leg hold traps, which are banned in most states now for taking fur bearers. But the pole traps are placed on top of a large pole mounted fixed to 8 feet above the ground, and then a bird of prey, whether it be a great horned owl or red-tailed hawk, comes along to alight on top of the pole, steps in the trap, and is killed in that process.
Protecting animals that are held on shooting preserves. Shooting preserves are plentiful on the eastern shore. Hunting is big business on the eastern shore.
That is correct.
In protecting animals, those would be, you mentioned, pinioned birds. Pinioned birds are mallards, specifically, ducks.
That's the general species that is allowed under the federal regulations to be raised for release in these
regulated shooting area. The Maryland has what they call commercial RSA is a regulated shooting area that is open to the public, while non-commercial RSA is closed to the public or has closed membership. And then they're using what seems to be these pinioned or captive mallards. Pinioned are they've had a joint removed so they cannot fly, and these birds are being used as decoys to attract.
They were commonly used for that purpose. These birds are raised in what we'll call duck factories, for lack of a better term. They're sold to these preserves or regulated shooting areas for release and then to be hunted. but oftentimes they are so tamed, they're fed with large troughs, automated systems. So when they hear the system, or hear the corn or a grain being placed in the system, they immediately are drawn, much like a dinner bell sounded. And so when they're moved to the RSAs, there's usually a feeder associated with that transplant. And the bird become acclimated to the feeder. Ironically, is placed within a matter of yards of the shooting blind the hunters will occupy.
So they're not necessarily being used as decoys. These birds that are tame and being drawn to a feeder are being hunted.
In many times they are used as decoys purposefully, but oftentimes they're just so tame they will not fly. They literally have to be kicked out of the way to take flight in order to be harvested.
And how many, I mean, you probably don't have an exact number, but how many times did you see the poisonings occur on the Delmarva Peninsula because of this?
Countless times. Monitored these areas extensively for at least 2 continuous years, both on the ground and from the air, and generally saw them in association with these type of locations.
With how many bald eagles killed because of it, or birds of prey, I should say?
Well, certainly in excess of 3 dozen. Much of the problems associated with the pathological investigation or necropsies of these birds is that many of the pesticides, Furidan being one, deteriorate very quickly in the wild. So you have the carcass of the victim being attacked by maggots, flies, and beetle larvae, things like that, and deteriorating very, very quickly. And if the carcass itself is not submitted within a very timely fashion, as little as 24 hours, the essence of the poison that it might have been exposed to is not there. It deteriorates. So you have a carcass with the inability to discern exactly what may or may have caused the death.
So that's one of the problems with investigating the cases. Furidan, by the way, is the trade name for Carbofuran.
That is correct. It is a carbamate family pesticide. Carbamates were invented to replace previous acetylcholinesterase inhibiting pesticides, DDT being granular chlorine, that we all know what the impact of that was.
Let's take another quick break. We'll be right back on the 1430 Connection. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. I'm talking to Frank Kuncir, a retired special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He spent many years investigating poisonings of wildlife on the eastern shore, including our national symbol, the bald eagle, which continues this year. We've had our 2 most recent cases were March and April of this year, and I have a total of 35 that I've counted dead birds since 2013, all either by Carbofuran or believed to be. Frank, you volunteered to help with current efforts.
I have volunteered in whatever way I can to assist, whether it be through training of concerned individuals or any other method that I could assist the service with.
Did you ever get a response?
It's pending. These things in government sometimes take time if they are to come to fruition. But I am available to them, obviously, by phone.
They knew that you've been talking to me, I'm sure.
That is correct.
All right. And you've read my reporting on some of this. You saw that I've connected by property owner 2 properties where these incidents have occurred are owned by the same person. And I think you also saw that one of those properties is related by a neighbor to a third property, and they work together, Maryland State Troopers at the Easton Barrack. You saw all of this, right?
I took the effort to actually plot these out on county maps just to see exactly where they were found, if I could assist the service. Did
your plotting of what you've seen and what I've reported is similar?
Yes, and I want to be cautious and not infringe on the current ongoing investigations that are still open.
Fair enough. Yes, and in fact, when I said I have a Freedom of Information Act in or a few in for some of these cases, I will not get information until they've been closed. And once the cases are closed, that's when I can receive information. The February 2016 case in Federalsburg with the 13 bald eagles was closed. That's how I got the information on that one. January 2017, the 5 bald eagles in Easton, Maryland, also closed, and that's how I got information on that one. There's others that are still open. And I agree with Frank that we do not want to do anything that might harm the investigation and catching the bad guys or gals that did this. Okay, so I'm sorry, Frank, you were about to say?
I point out as it related to your New Jersey incident that you spoke of. Similar agricultural situation on the other side of the Delaware Bay, Delaware River, as we have in both Delaware and Maryland and Lower Peninsula, Delmarva, and Virginia. Similar interests, hunting sites, etc. The duck factory that I mentioned to you, one of those is actually in New Jersey on the other side. So the similar type of activity, and in other states as well, but it's not as concentrated as they are in the upper eastern shore of Maryland.
So as the crow flies, or eagle, it's directly above the Delmarva Peninsula, Pedricktown, New Jersey. It's all of these incidents have happened on or in very close proximity to farms. When you were investigating them, you said all of these happened on or in very close proximity to regulated shooting areas, yes?
Yes, and another term being a shooting preserve, where pheasants are released for pheasants and quail are released for harvest.
Now, let's talk about U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service being notoriously kind of locked down with information. I had to put in FOIA's, Freedom of Information Act request, to get the information I received. I have to date talked to no current U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service special agents, not by my choice, but because none have been made available to me. I've gotten very little information from the service. You called it a prohibition of information. And by the way, Maryland Natural Resources Police was also in the same scenario. They weren't getting a lot of information, yes?
That is based in law. Many of the policies addressing these open investigations comes from the Department of Justice and guidance by the Environmental and Wildlife section of DOJ in Washington. Basically precludes the release of any information that could jeopardize both concerned citizens who might be willing informants concerned about the potential defendants themselves. We live in a society where, criminally speaking, when there's potential exposure to imprisonment or loss of one's freedom, that you're not guilty, have to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. And with that comes the necessity to be very, very restrictive in the release of any information that might jeopardize a citizen's freedoms.
So for those of us that have absolutely no knowledge of how law enforcement works, other than what we've seen on TV, where the feds come in, take over the case, and the locals get upset about it, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Exactly. We're wildlife investigators to have the capabilities that one sees on many of our crime programs. These things would be nipped in the bud quite easily, aside from the forces of nature working against poison victims being identified and collected, submitted for evidentiary purposes in determining cause of death. You also have the necessity to be ever constantly in the field doing searches. That requires manpower and time, and the service doesn't have that many agents in the nation. EPA does not have that many agents in the nation. It is literally looking for a needle in a haystack.
That's one of the things that you had said previously when we had a conversation. The reason why it's so hard to make these cases stick and bring charges, it's a very difficult case to prove. Oftentimes, it's a tree falling in the wilderness that no one hears.
That is correct.
We are out of time on this show, but this is a two-part show. We will be returning with Frank next Friday at 2 on the 1430 Connection. Please join us for the rest of this conversation. This is Donna Cole. We will see you next week on the 1430 Connection.